Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alex Georgiana, and I lead STEER's practice in the development and funding of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. I'll be your host for today's webinar, and we've got nearly 100 people joining us today, representing as many as 40 local authorities. So why are we all here this afternoon? What's the topic for us to discuss? Well, the pace at which local government authorities are attracting private investment to their EV charging projects has fallen behind. While OZEV had directed its Levi grantees to engage dynamic purchasing systems, those frameworks are now widely understood to be out of compliance with procurement legislation and therefore not appropriate for establishing the regulated concession contracts by which LAs will secure investment. The existing pre-Brexit rules were to be replaced with revised UK legislation later next month. However, we learned last week that enactment of those rules has now been postponed until February of next year. In this confusing regulatory environment, anxious local authorities sponsoring public EV charging projects are understandably hesitant, determined to take their projects to market so as to secure their commercial and service delivery objectives and demonstrate compliance with regulation. Today, I'll be joined by Jonathan Crowley, a partner within the commercial team of Ashford's LLP. And we're going to talk about the process by which local authorities attract private investment to the development of public EV charging infrastructure. We do this for local authorities across the country, and we'll share our insights as to how to re-accelerate the pace at which the UK embraces electric vehicles. We're going to keep this brief. You're welcome. And there will be opportunities for questions afterwards. To pose a question, click the Join the Chat button, enter your name, and a chat box will open where you can type in your question. We'll address as many of those at the end as we can. The development of charging infrastructure projects matters. Between the first lockdown and the end of 2022, the penetration of EVs within all new car registrations rocketed from single digits up to about 25%. But since then, in the 5 quarters ending in Q1 of this year, that growth in EV penetration has plateaued at about that 25% figure. Of course, there are many factors impacting EV uptake, and I wrote about a number of those factors earlier this week in our Voices of STEER blog that you can find on LinkedIn. But a slowdown in the development of public EV charging resources can't help. Within the public sector, there is now a significant backlog of subsidized and unsubsidized EV development projects seeking private investment. Perhaps the biggest driver for this backlog has been uncertainty within the councils around what good tendering for private investment looks like. As we move to a net zero future, delays of any kind are rarely helpful. But this backlog of commercially viable projects, I should say otherwise commercially viable projects, is not without impact. It jeopardizes the visible supply of public chargers along the road that can provide comfort to those consumers who are now considering an electric vehicle. It jeopardizes the ability of overstressed and temporarily underengaged charge point operators to turn their businesses around quickly and resume effectively addressing investment opportunities. Here at STEER, we've noticed a number of CPOs laying off staff over the past several months in their effort to preserve capital for investment. But most worryingly, and with an eye towards next month's budget announcement, this backlog of again, otherwise commercially viable charging projects, may influence government's perspective on continuing public support for our national EV transition. A smooth transition to an electric vehicle future requires numerous stakeholders to move forward as one. Levi is specifically crafted to accelerate the pace of charger development to seed faster uptake of electric vehicles themselves. A slowdown in the pace by which subsidy attracts private investment makes that EV transition just a little bit harder. But the work of Steer and Ashford's brings clarity to uncertainty in helping local authorities deliver progress. In anticipation of today's webinar, my colleague Elaine Meskey, who works with me in our EV practice here at Steer, spent some time talking with Paul Bragg, the Highways and Network Manager for the London Borough of Barnet. Under Paul's direction, Barnet will soon have over 2,000 chargers, making it one of the largest networks in the country. And while Paul couldn't be with us this afternoon, he works at the coalface of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, untangling the web of commercial, technical, and financial imperatives to make charge points just work for thirsty EV drivers. Let's go to the interview, and then we'll come back and talk more about this critical path in tendering for private investment.
Hello, my name is Elaine Meskey. I'm a principal consultant here at Steer. I work in zero emission vehicle infrastructure. I am joined today by Paul Bragg. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, I'm Paul Bragg. I'm the Head of Network and Infrastructure for Barnet Council. One part of my role is I'm responsible for policy and rollout of EV charge points, and that's something that we are very focused on at the moment and working through a number of projects.
Barnet Council are fast approaching 2,000 chargers installed, and Paul has led these initiatives and worked with 5 different charge point operators for the rollout of different types of charge points. So Paul, let me start with the hottest topic of the year that the industry has learned that there is limited scope for use of frameworks and DPSs in concession contracts for EV infrastructure. Open tenders are now deemed to be the way forward, particularly after the Procurement Act 2023 goes live later this October. But what are the challenges that open tenders present to councils, and particularly those councils that are earlier on in EV uptake and infrastructure development?
That certainly is a challenge for the future. Now we know that DPSs are not really suitable for concession style contracts, which are the types of contracts that generally local authorities now looking to roll out. The open procedure is really the new go-to. It's not something that many local authorities have a great deal of experience with, certainly not in the EV marketplace. So there's a fair bit more work involved in terms of putting together your documentation rather than using a DPS where a lot of that documentation is prepared in advance and then is adaptable. So starting from scratch, it's a much bigger task. There is obviously the risk of getting things wrong. And certainly from our point of view, we feel that it's been really important that whilst we engage internally with our procurement teams and our legal teams to get advice, that this is all a new market to them. It's not something that they have experience in. There's been a little bit of reluctance at Barnet to actually give that advice, so we have been pushed to look for external support and to find where we can get that support from. So we've been to a legal firm who specialises in procurement, who have helped us to draft the contract clauses for that open tender. And we're aware that there are other consultancies out there that specialise in this area and can give local authorities support. So we've certainly not wanted to take that risk by using internal resources that don't really have the skills to be able to support us and make sure that we utilise the resources that are out there who specialise in this area that can make sure that we get things right.
And just to drill down on that, you've spoken about legal expertise with the procurement regulation, but there's probably another element to success in EVI development. Perhaps yourselves and Barnett have this in-house because of your history of charger rollout and the CPOs you've worked with, but is there industry-specific knowledge that you need to help develop the objectives and specifications for EVI development?
I think that very much depends on each local authority. We've done quite a lot in this space now. We have dedicated resources working on EV, so we're in a quite lucky position that we feel that we know what our policy is set out to achieve, and we know how we could write the technical specification to achieve that. But as I say, the procurement and the legal side of things is where we needed to support. However, I am aware that there's a lot of local authorities out there that probably haven't got that expertise in-house in terms of the market research that we've done on EV and the learnings that we've got from what we've done to date. So again, I think it is wise for local authorities in that position to seek advice externally from those who are specialising or have done a lot more in this space.
When we work with clients who are wanting to tender for charging infrastructure, our service offer includes financial forecasting to validate the business case and investment opportunity for the different parties. Ensuring the deal being presented is attractive to private investors and the service providers is critical, particularly as we don't anticipate much more government funding beyond Levi. Paul, what are your thoughts on that? Do you agree or not with that statement?
Yeah, I think it is quite crucial, actually, that if you're going to do all of the work and go through all the expenditure of putting a tender out, what you obviously want to achieve is a lot of interest and competition. So receiving a number of competitive tenders back. What you put to market has to be attractive to the market. And if that legwork has been done up front so that you can show the market that there has been some due diligence done and that the sites that are being proposed are potentially viable, then that will certainly help with the interest with the marketplace and should be good for the competition.
In some cases, we can work our fee for transaction advisory services into the deal or transaction itself. Can you tell me if and why this might be attractive to local authorities?
Yeah, I certainly think that's a great unique offer, because one of the things that local authorities tend to do is to pursue procurements without actually setting a budget and realising how much a procurement is actually going to cost. So not having to worry about setting a budget and worrying about the financing of the procurement is very positive, knowing that there is another way to actually fund it. So I think, that service offering that you've spoken to me about is certainly attractive to us, and I'm sure should be attractive to other local authorities as well.
Well, thanks, Elaine, and thanks, Paul. And I think I should note that the legal consultant that Paul engaged for Barnett was, in fact, Jonathan Crowley of Ashford. So we're in good company here today. In summary, Paul talked about how open tendering will be a challenge for many authorities who may also need technical advice in scoping demand and in developing investable projects. A successful tender requires proper due diligence around that demand, the financial return, and the business case that will attract investment. And finally, some cash-strapped authorities may appreciate the opportunity to fund some of the procurement costs against the deal itself. The most common business structure for the development of public charging sponsored by the local authority is one in which the local authority deploys real estate and other resources in a well-developed business case to which it attracts private investment. Though referred to as procurement, tendering for private investment isn't buying. Instead, It's the selling of an investment opportunity that satisfies emerging driver demand, that derives incremental value from public resources deployed, and that yields to attract private investment, all in compliance with procurement legislation. The process we typically see has two elements, and Jonathan and I will talk them through here. In the pre-market engagement, the sponsoring LA develops the commercially viable project that attracts investment. In the first step, it's a robust identification of emerging demand for energy and infrastructure, itself a function of increasing EV uptake, which is compelled by the ZEV mandate. Second, that projected demand must be converted into a comprehensive financial model, identifying costs of the project, revenue from electricity sales, and ultimately the free cash flow that validates investment. Next, a business case must define the structure of the business, the roles of the local authority and private investors, and the allocation of value to both parties. And finally, all this can be summarized in a compelling prospectus that concisely defines the opportunity for prospective investors. Jonathan, I've gone through the pre-engagement portion, but I wondered if you'd talk more about the market engagement.
Of course. Thank you, Alex. At Ashfords, we're currently advising a number of local authorities on their EV procurements, a number of which are currently out to market, so they're thoroughly into that market engagement stage. And some are just entering into that market engagement stage, just prior to publishing. And of course, there are a couple of projects that are close to getting their final approval through the OZEV program board. So, as Alex mentioned, local authority procurement is a highly regulated area, and a failure to comply with the relevant rules can lead to the local authority facing a procurement challenge. And the problem with a procurement challenge, well, there are two main problems. First, they can result in a financial liability to the local authority. And secondly, they can delay the project, especially if the procurement process needs to be rerun. And of course, that has then a knock-on consequence for those projects that are grant funded, because the grant funding bodies will typically set out specific deadlines by which the grant funds need to be deployed. So a procurement challenge is basically bad news from a local authority's point of view and not at all appealing. And so local authorities will often ask us to advise on the procurement route as a first step. Without wishing for this webinar to become a procurement training session, the choice of procurement process will depend on three main factors. First, is there an appropriate framework under which the contract or opportunity can be tendered? And of course, we've come to the conclusion over the last few months that a DPS and a concession do not mix. The second is when will the tender be published? Bearing in mind the change in procurement rules in February 2025 now. And the third element is whether the opportunity or the contract is classed as a works contract, a services contract, or a concession contract. The vast majority of EV procurements that we've been involved with recently have involved the procurement of a concession contract. And as Alex says, this is the selling of an opportunity. That's not to say that every EV project will be a concession contract. So it's often part of our scope just to use the outline business case that is developed during that pre-market stage to establish whether that is what is being procured. I think it's fair to say that procuring concession is not business as usual for local authorities. And I think the interview with Paul kind of demonstrates that. And so what we want to achieve through our advice is to ensure that the local authority has the level of assurance it needs in order to step forward into the market with confidence and minimise that risk of a procurement challenge. Once the procurement route has been identified, really it's time to crack on with preparing the tender documentation. So that's the tender preparation stage on the slide there. Typically, the tender documents will include the instructions to bidders on what is required of them in terms of their final submission. The tender documents will set out the rules of the procurement process. Is it a single stage process? Is it a multi-stage process with dialogue with the local authority? What's the process for asking clarifications? The third important element of the tender documentation is that it sets out the evaluation criteria through which the submissions will be scored. And this will enable the local authority to establish which tender is the most economically advantageous tender, to use the procurement jargon. And the final big piece of the puzzle in terms of that tender preparation is establishing what the terms of the contract are and drafting that contract. Once the contract has been published and it's gone out to market, along with the other tender documents, we'll often help local authorities with responding to clarification questions, and where there is a dialogue process in the procurement, then we'll help with the legal and commercial dialogue sessions. So actually we've mentioned quite the contract quite a few times so far in this webinar. Whichever procurement process is adopted, ultimately bidders will need to be provided with a draft contract that they will be required to sign up to if they are selected as the successful tenderer. And so the contract needs to be provided during the procurement process. This also enables bidders to price the risks under that contract during the competitive stage of market engagement. Our experience in the EV field especially is that no two contracts are the same. Although whatever the terms of the contract, in order to extract the best value from the competition process, a contract really needs to tick three boxes. First, it needs to be clear in its allocation of risks, i.e. who needs to do what, by when, and what are the consequences of a breach. Second, the contract needs to be bankable. That is, it can't be so one-sided towards the local authority that no bank would ever be willing to provide working capital to the successful tenderer to get the project kick-started. And thirdly, the contract really needs to take into account the requirements of any grant funding that's sitting in the background, whether that's Levi funding in accordance with the grant funding agreement. Sometimes there are aid intensities that need to be respected, or in the context of OZEV funded contracts, the contract will need to satisfy the various requirements of the OZEV heads of terms. In the background, we often advise on the issues that relate to the contract and will feed into the terms of the contract. For example, in the context of a local authority procurement that involves electric vehicle charging points on non-highways land, the contract will typically require the local authority to grant a lease to the concessionaire. So it's important that the local authority is comfortable that it has the legal rights it needs in order to grant that lease. So we'll often carry out legal due diligence in order to establish whether the local authority owns that land, or if it is the leaseholder of that land, are there any provisions under the lease that need to be passed down to the concessionaire under the concession contract. Sometimes we find that the local authority has already leased that car park to a third party, and so we'll need to work out establish a workaround in order to work out the best way of being able to grant a lease to the concessionaire in due course. Another area that we'll often get involved with is carrying out due diligence on existing contracts. The two types of contracts that spring to mind most readily are where the local authority has entered into a street lighting PFI contract and the local authority is procuring lamp column mounted chargers. And so there's an interface there between the eventual concessionaire and the PFI contractor that we need to iron out and make sure that there are appropriate provisions in the contract to deal with that. Another type of contract that will interface or may interface with the new concessionaire is where the local authority already has a number of EV assets under its care, which it is contracted for, and which it wants to be subsumed into the new concession contract going forwards. And so the results of that due diligence will all get fed into the contract terms, and they tend to be quite local authority specific. So once the local authority has received the final tenders from all the tenderers, we go through to the evaluation stage. Often we're involved in helping local authorities with the evaluation process. So that could be supervising evaluation to make sure that the local authority carries out the evaluation in accordance with the published evaluation methodology. Sometimes we're asked to facilitate moderation of scoring across tenders and the like. After that evaluation process has been completed, the local authority will have established which tender represents the most economically advantageous tender. And so then we need to proceed with the other documents that will bring the procurement process to an end. This will usually involve drafting standstill letters that are required under a procurement process, the preferred bidder letter, the reserve bidder letter if that's required. Sometimes we're asked to provide inputs into cabinet and council papers. And last but not least, remembering why we're going through this process, we will help the local authority collate that final contract, which will be the contract published, supplemented with the information from the successful tenderer, and bring this all together so that it's a contract that can be properly signed and executed. So that's an incredibly quick canter through that market engagement process. There is a lot of work to do, but it's not impossible to achieve with the right input and the right level of resource. We're aware that each local authority has its own level of procurement expertise, its own level of in-house ability to draft a concession contract, and Paul made reference to that in the interview earlier. And so for that reason, we're more than happy to scope the level of our involvement to dovetail with the needs, ability and capacity of the local authority in question. That said, a number of local authorities that we're currently working with have asked us to advise on all of those points that I've touched on in order to achieve the maximum level of assurance possible.
That's hugely helpful, Jonathan, and I'm sure there are many people listening this afternoon or who are going to start to be breathing a sigh of relief. Is it fair to say, and is it the reason for our webinar, in fact, that a confused regulatory environment has triggered confusion and anxiety, and in fact a backlog in the processing of these projects? But that the rules around regulatory compliance are clear, and advisors like Steer and Ashford's can help clarify these issues for the client and make sure that these projects get funded and deployed.
Yes, I think using the DPS, for example, or an existing framework is a tremendous comfort blanket. As Paul said, it's there. They don't have to start from scratch. And there is hesitation and reticency over starting from scratch, which is the environment that we find ourselves in now.
Terrific. So just some housekeeping now. It's worth noting that if local authorities are interested in potentially instructing Steer and Ashford's, that both of our firms are on the correct frameworks through which you would engage us. What's more, for Steer, in our role as transaction advisor, as Elaine mentioned, we can sometimes build some of the cost of our services into the deal itself, often taking the form of a draw against license fees receivable by the local authority and paid to Steer upon contract execution. So we've thrown an enormous amount at you in the last 30 minutes. And I believe after the event, we'll be sending you all the link to the recording of the session, as well as a little briefing about the critical path that we've described. And furthermore, should you find it useful, I think we'd be glad to facilitate one-on-one sessions with you and your teams to do a little gap analysis of how far along your projects are, and even think about some interventions that may help you achieve your objectives. Between us, we've got at least a few decades of experience, and together with yourselves, we should be able to do something of a health check to support decision makers from your organization. So that's what we have for you today, and we're ending bang on 1:30. But we did promise to entertain some questions. I know we've had some questions in some of the pre-event work that we've done. And I wonder if my colleague Sarah wouldn't mind coming in and moderating those questions.
Sure thing. Yes, hi everyone. My name's Sarah Glynn. I'm part of the technical team supporting this webinar here today. So I'm going to moderate the Q&A section. Lots of you actually completed the pre-event questionnaire that we sent out last week. So we do actually have lots of questions already, which is fantastic. Some of these will have already been covered with the content today, but I'll start with some of the remaining questions that I don't think perhaps we've quite answered, while everyone kind of heads over to the chat box to ask any more that they might have. Alex, I'm going to start off with what I think was the $1 million question. I think that we had from the pre-event questionnaire, and someone's from a local authority has asked, how do we make sure that we attract sufficient investment attention to our project? I'm sure a question that is on the minds of lots of our attendees today.
Yeah, that is the $1 million question. Remember, I mentioned that procurement isn't buying, it's selling. And by that, I mean that the project that's being developed has to balance the interests of the EV driving customers, the local authority, and the charge point operating private investor. So it is really important that the project developer, the local authority, put together a business case that acknowledges the interest of all three of those parties and balances them in the investment opportunity itself. We have seen procurements that have failed because they've been overly prescriptive to terms that the private investors simply can't accept because it doesn't earn them a yield against their investment. It doesn't give them return on investment. And so that's why we believe really strongly in this pre-engagement effort, where STEER acts as a transaction advisor, helping the local authority put together the business case, the demand projection, the financial model, the business case describing roles and value participation thereon, and puts it together in a concise prospectus, which really drives, for instance, the commercial specification in the tender itself. So that's all really about, if we are selling something, we need to make sure that what we're selling is of value.
Great answer, Alex. Thank you for covering that. Jonathan, I'm going to come to you now because we've had a legal question, so you're absolutely the man for us here. A viewer has asked, how detailed or complete does our draft contract need to be? Are the Levi heads of terms sufficient? And is there a standard form of contract that they can pull off the shelf, as it were?
3 questions. Right, okay.
Lucky you.
So how detailed does the draft contract need to be? So quite aside from what's required under the procurement rules, it's really best to have that complete contract out with the market before they have submitted their final bids. And the reason for that is you get your contract out to the bidders and they can price all the risks in the contract. And you also minimize any potential for negotiation to arise after you have carried out your evaluation and worked out which is the most economically advantageous tender. So really, it's you're just, even from a common sense point of view, you're not in a good place if you've carried out your evaluation and then you have a negotiation exercise afterwards. So our message is, apart from a procurement point of view and just making the most of competition point of view, is get your complete contract out to the market as part of the tender documentation. I think your second question was about whether the Levi heads of terms is sufficient.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, yes, I would say, depending on the procurement process that you adopt, they might be as a starter for 10. If you've got a multi-stage procurement process, because the procurement for this particular local authority is particularly complex, you might start with some heads of terms, which are then gradually developed through the process of dialogue with all the bidders. However, ultimately, before you ask all the bidders to submit their final tenders, again, you should have your final contract in place for the reasons given before. I think the third question there was, is there a standard form of contracts that you can pull off the shelf? And I think every local authority would probably wish that there was, but I don't think there is. Obviously, at Ashford's, we've got an array of precedents that we can draw on, and that, even for, whether it's a works contract or a services contract or a concession contract, obviously we've got the forms of contract that we have worked on with other clients in the past. So we've probably got model clauses that will fit most scenarios, but nevertheless, they do need to be brought together and stitched together into one cohesive whole. And another thing that I'd probably just mention in this regard is that whilst we're using the umbrella term EV procurement, each local authority is different. Some local authorities have street lighting, PFIs. The real estate angle is almost invariably different from one local authority to another, just because you're talking about different parcels of land on which the charge points will be located. And so all these things will just go into the mix and mean that every contract is bespoke at the end of the day.
Thanks for clearing that up, Jonathan. Alex, I'm going to come back to you, and I think this question kind of harks back to that confusion that I think you talked about at the start. This person has asked, didn't the application we submitted for Levi already cover the pre-market engagement steps, and can I still use the procurement documentation / strategy included in my Levi application?
It's a tricky question to answer, actually. I'm going to do my best. The Levi applications that Steer undertook for our public sector clients are terribly good at fulfilling their purpose, which was giving OZEV and the Department for Transport a good sense that the local authority was going to be a responsible steward of this value, of this money. I think it's somewhat of a different question that's being answered when we think about not simply getting that good feeling through to the DFT that we're a good steward, but also indicating to the private investor that we're a good partner, that we understand the commercial objectives of the project for both ourselves and for the private investor. And we describe the project in ways that really answer the private investor's questions, which often are just quite simple. It's simply, how much risk is there in whether or not this amount of revenue and therefore this amount of free cash flow is going to be generated by the investment that I'm funding? So in general, yes, the work that's been done to prepare the Levi application is valuable and useful, but not always sufficient to really build that investment prospectus that's going to attract the private investor. There's also a little bit of a self-inflicted wound here, in that the Levi application was prepared now 12 months ago. And the increasing development of demand changes to some extent the thesis in which the investor is investing. So yes, it's important work and it's useful, but in general, it might fall short of meeting the objectives that the local authority, the project sponsor, has in attracting private investment to a commercially viable project.
That makes sense. So I guess the answer is it could be, but worth kind of reevaluating at this kind of stage. Jonathan, I'm going to head back to you now, if that's okay, because we've had a question about compliance. So they've asked, what happens if we fail to demonstrate compliance with procurement legislation, if this hasn't already been covered?
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, if you fail to comply with the procurement rules, an unsuccessful bidder can raise a procurement challenge in respect of your procurement. And if there is merit to those arguments raised by the bidder, it will almost inevitably cause delay. It might cause a failure of the procurement process. And so you might be back to square one in your procurement process. Obviously, that's quite wearing on the private sector as well, because the other bidders will have been ploughing development capital into producing their bids. And so you might find that when you rerun your procurement the next time, there's less market engagement, because frankly, the market's exhausted and it's gone to seek other opportunities elsewhere. And the knock-on process for the grant-funded EV projects is that frequently those grant funding agreements will have specific deadlines by which you need to demonstrate that the money has been deployed. And if you have to stop a procurement process or even restart a procurement process, then you're really putting those timescales under stress. And that means that deliverability for the private sector is even more stretching. And the more stress you put on the private sector, the more they risk price. So you get less and less value as delays accrue. Just kind of another related point is, there's that saying, turn that frown upside down. And whilst I know that people look at the procurement rules and the procurement process and they roll their eyes and think, this is another legal hurdle that I have to go through, I think you can see procurement as an opportunity. It's a tool. You can leverage it. You can really drive competition in the market. And if you drive competition, you can get much better value outcomes and in the long term, much better delivery ultimately as well. So I think it's not just a matter of, we've got to tick the boxes to comply, but actually it's how do we get the most out of the procurement process and really drive value.
But Jonathan, can I just add something to that? You're talking about more. You can get better, you can get more. It's not necessarily, for instance, the amount of rent to be derived by the local authority from the project. More might mean simply a larger project. In other words, a larger ratio of private investment to public investment, a larger commitment from the investors to put more charging resources in the ground to, in a snowball effect, attract more adoption of electric vehicles in the conurbation.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Okay, we're coming to the last sort of 30 seconds really of today's event. So I think I will just say thank you to Alex and Jonathan, obviously Elaine and Paul as well, who took part in the pre-interview for the webinar. As Alex referred to earlier, there will be an email going out to you this afternoon that will contain the recording of this event and the contact details for Alex and Jonathan if you want to contact them directly. And also an invitation, as Alex explained earlier, to a one-on-one session with the speakers today if you feel that you would like a little bit more of a bespoke conversation, and this webinar's kind of thrown up more questions and opportunities you think for your authority. So we'll leave it there today. Thank you very much for watching, and we look forward to engaging with you on this topic in the coming days and weeks. So thank you so much.